Hey guys, so I had another big jump in my Battlegrounds climb that I kind of wanted to share just some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So my last video I reached the 8K mark. I now reached the 8.5K MMR range. So we're going to be playing that game in the background, and I'm also going to use it as a kind of just an intro for how to get into the dragons as a particular comp. Um, so, just for kind of background on where I came. So, last video we were at 8K, now at 8.5. I was able to do this in 29 games. This was an average of roughly plus 16 MMR per game. I think one of the big standout things is just the consistency here. So I actually only had one first during all this, which I think it kind of goes back to my last video of I said one, what I need to improve, and two, what I think the actual best way to climb out of these like mid to starting to push higher MMR ranges is not actually pushing for those first place wins that often, just because they're riskier generally. Uh, but so during this, I only had one win. It was using a Van Cleef Lover strap. I'll have a video out for that soon. But I guess the main thing is, for that game, I didn't even really play a risky game for getting that first place. It was a very consistent game. The other thing that's notable is I didn't have any eighths in it, and it was really something consistent to through fourth placements. I think it was 60% of games was in that range. And then I guess the last thing that's kind of notable about this part of the climb was that it took me roughly 400 games to go to 8K, which was where I was really hard stuck. If you remember, I was in that like 6 to 8K range for a really long time. And the major change that I recognized was picking up apples early and playing that early game. And then one of the other things was less forcing of tribes. I think a lot of times, especially using HS Replay, you see these tribes that are doing particularly well. They give you the comp to go, and then you think you have to force those 7 minions. And I think what I really see is that's not necessarily the way to play. A lot of it's just getting the best stats out there, and then trying to find ways to enable other units. And just for record of this, so if we look at just my climb from 8 to 8.5, the tribes were only even recorded for about 55% of my games, which means for 50%, roughly, I wasn't even playing like a hard set comp. I was playing, something that was more just a big stuff hybrid type comp where, um, it's really just trying to get on the board, try to maintain the board, and fight for those higher placements. And then once you're enabled, that's when you can start going big. Um, I guess the last thing I kind of want to point out are just two I guess meta tips right now. The first thing is that all tribes seem relatively close. I think Murlocs have been really gutted during the spell meta, which just really has enabled the more stat tribes to compete a little bit better. So Quillboars are probably still one of the tier 4 like worst tribes out there. But I think they're even more enabled now just because they're able to get big with gems, and there's less Murlocs that are just doing poison scam to fight that. And then the other big enabled tribe has been the demons. Um, Finally, the last thing I guess I want to point out is kind of a meta change. This is going to start going into kind of my way of thinking about how to play dragons right now. So right now, I before was kind of saying that you should always just play for stats on the first couple of turns, and I guess there's one big exception that I've kind of learned this, and it's even reflected within HS Replay, and that's the upfront front Drake, which is this one tier one 1/1 minion. And what's crazy about it is this play impact that HS Replay has as a stat, which essentially is saying, what's the chance of you placing better based on this. And on upfront front drake alone, it has a zero point 0.5 increase if you play it turn 1, which means you're expected to do zero point 0.5 places better just by playing this on turn 1, which is crazy impact for a card on tier 1. And this really enables a lot of the other minions that are within the dragon comp. So before, I guess the other cards that we're kind of looking at is if we look at tier two, you now have a smuggler enabled because you have a dragon that might be getting buffs. Even the Skyfin is a reasonable card now because um, you're going to be printing off dragons with the front drake. That could be potentially a battle cry. Um, or any other type of buff. So Skyfin's now kind of a flex unit. Skyfin's definitely the worst of the dragons early, but it's still available. Um, the other things you can start looking into doing is trying to just skip your early level up and try to get 7 minions on the board early so that you can start buffing the Sand Spewer a turn earlier. And what's pretty cool about this is it's a 2/2 buff if you have the Smuggler on the board. And then I guess once you start getting up higher, there's a couple ways that you can go with dragons. One that I ended up going in the game that you're going to be watching is doing kind of a flex into elementals and using Smuggler to buff the Sandrake and using that to also buff Master of Realities. And that's kind of how you can do a flex from going from the dragons into elementals. Um, the other option you can do is once you have Smuggler, that's a reasonable enable for going into Caligos and just giving your minions an extra buff. And eventually you can get rid of the Smuggler for Brand to double your battle cries. But that just makes it so that transition's a little bit easier. Um, and then finally, the last thing you can do with dragons right now is just kind of play a like Drakari in the mid game to get you to that late game scaling. And the Drakari does really good with the elementals. That was kind of what I was digging for in the game that you're going to watch. Is I was holding on to a pair of the pirates that print spells. And then I was also kind of trying to find a way to just buff my Master of Realities more. And the ways that you can do that is um, just either Drakari or the Drakari spell, the Primal Staff. And then the other option is there was a couple turns where I think I did double Whelp Smuggler, so I had a, and that, each of them procs separately for the 1 health, and that makes it so that your Master of Realities scaling is essentially um, now 50% more. So it's getting one stat from the Drake, it's getting one stat then from each of the smugglers. So there's a little bit of flexibility there. I think dragons are in an interesting spot where they pair really well with a lot of the other tribes, and that's because they're so just battle cry focused, and pretty much every tribe, besides maybe Beast, has a like battle cry that's kind of associated with them. Um, so yeah, thanks for listening. But hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of direction for how you should be seeing how to enable dragons and how to scale them to a point where you're getting to that late game with not just a bunch of a mess board, where you hopefully have had some stuff scale, and that way you're safe when you're fighting in those top 4 positions. So thanks. Have a good one.